But let's turn now to our first panel, where we look at what is driving energy strategies. We're delighted to have Ruby McGregor-Smith, the CEO of Mitie, as our keynote today. Mitie is a great company which has changed its strategy through its awareness of energy. We look forward to hearing from Ruby on why they're doing it. Ruby will then join a distinguished panel chaired by Chris Bowden. They'll come up here, looking at the future price of energy. Following that, we will then beam live to Sweden, where we will hear from IKEA why they're investing heavily in renewable energy. But before that, I just want to hand you over to our partner for today's event, E.ON. Many struggle to understand how a big six could be committed to reduction. How can a company want to sell less? Well, I think if you're aware of the big challenges in society, you can, and you might find yourself partnering with an event which seeks to aid reduction. It's telling that E.ON are the biggest providers of ESCOs in district heating. They supply more social housing PV than any other company, and they provide the most EPCs to the public sector. So without further ado, I hand you over to Mike Woodhead from E.ON.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Jim, for the introduction. And it would be pleased to hear that I'm not going to whoop or yell or cheer everybody on. You all know my company, E.ON, and I also hope you know that whilst we sell our customers power and gas, we're absolutely passionate about encouraging those same customers to reduce the energy they consume, and in return reduce their costs and contribute to carbon reduction. I'm here today as the Managing Director of E.ON Sustainable Energy. My business is a discrete business unit in E.ON. Our objective is to work with both the corporate and public sector organisations to promote energy efficiency and decentralised energy. So why did we think it was important to support today's event? Well, one thing we're not short of is the statistics. We all know that buildings account for 40% of energy use and use 33% of greenhouse gases, and that small businesses alone are probably wasting billions a year by not adopting energy efficiency measures. Irrespective of whether we believe the statistics or not, we only have to look around to know that there is much that can be done. There are some examples of what great leading organisations have done and are doing to reduce energy consumption, and we'll hear about some of those during today. Some businesses have gone through an enormous transformation, and I haven't heard of any who have said that was a mistake. However, the change isn't happening fast enough, and it's not happening wide enough. We have to do more, and we have to do more quickly. We somehow have to create a revolution. The problem, I think, is that no one seems to know why the change isn't happening and why it isn't happening more quickly and more wider, because I think to some of us it's absolutely obvious. Is it that the government isn't putting enough sticks into the system, or indeed enough carrots? There was an announcement last week by the Deputy Prime Minister that all companies listed on the stock exchange will have to report on greenhouse gases from the next financial year. I think that affects probably 2,000 organisations. But what else is it? Is there distrust? Is it a lack of knowledge? Is it a lack of leadership? I don't know, and I don't think anybody else has the answer either. What I hope, though, is that through greater activities, more organisations will see the benefits not only of carbon reduction but of energy cost savings. Whilst I would like to see more activity, there are, as I've mentioned, already some important actions that have taken place. As Jim mentioned, in the last 12 months, we've seen some important developments. We've just been announced as the preferred bidder on the Greenwich Peninsula project. This project will, our involvement on the project will involve an ESCO. It will involve the construction and operation of a district heating system for 10,000 residential units and commercial developments, which will generate enormous carbon savings. We've just completed the installation of solar PV on 5,000 social homes across the UK. Sainsbury's have just appointed us to install ground source heating using advanced and unique technology. The objective is to roll this out across 100 stores. And we've been involved on energy performance contracting in the public sector, and now see the private sector wanting to get involved in the same sort of contracting arrangements. All of these opportunities reduce carbon and create energy savings for customers. But some of these organisations have had to do something different. They've had to get into long-term relationships from 10 to 25 years, and in some cases even longer. So is this a problem, that organisations cannot get comfortable and with the longer-term nature of some of these solutions and are not able to look at the long-term horizon? We see a focus on decentralised energy and a move to a more collaborative approach to problem solving has been a way of tackling some of these issues. We've been forming city partnerships, bringing both public and businesses sectors together to try to start saving and trying to take a more holistic approach to the problems that we see. So why did we think it was important to be here today? Well, we want to understand more about what the issues are. We want to listen to the problems that organisations have, and we want to use our experience to try and find a solution so that we can advance more quickly. I suspect, however, that most of the people in the audience today, you actually get it. That's why you're here. So I think our challenge is to get more organisations like you to make a move so that we can start to create the revolution in what is such an important and exciting area. Thank you very much. I'd like to hand over to Ruby now to give the keynote speech.
Good morning, everyone. It's delightful to be here. I've not been to a conference around energy before, so for me, I'm pretty excited, actually. So for those of you that don't know much about Mitie, we're an outsourcing company, predominantly UK. So we employ 65,000 people in the UK, which makes a top 20 private sector employer, and we're only 25 years old. Mitie stands for Management Incentive Through Investment Equity. We have a passion for giving equity to our employees to help build long, sustainable businesses, and we're focused very heavily on doing that, particularly over the next decade. And I'm really proud to say that we've created around 100 original startups in Mitie, have created pretty much what we see today. We just announced results of revenues of 2 billion in the UK as well, and we are one of only 2 companies that have grown in the FTSE their earnings consecutively for over 25 years. When we started, our growth started very much in single services and outsourcing, from engineering services to cleaning to security to services that clients wanted in their buildings and infrastructure. But we saw very much a big move in the market. We lost our founder chairman to cancer in 2003, and our board sat down and we thought very clearly about, well, what is it we wanted to be as an organisation in outsourcing. We very much determined, having worked across many buildings and infrastructure, that there were some big changes happening. The changes that were happening was that clients needed more bundled services. They needed better services in their buildings. They needed people like us who operate in their buildings every day to actually explain and provide and support them on their long-term strategies. And the biggest decision we made in terms of what we wanted to do was to change very much our views around how we could very much influence in the world of energy. And we set about doing that in 2009 when we bought Dalkia FM in the UK. And there we bought a business that focused very much on energy management as part of what it very much did. And by acquiring Dalkia, it gave us the scale, the expertise, and the people that had worked with a passion in this industry for quite a long time. I don't need to tell you much about what energy and the energy management businesses of the world can do, but what I can tell you is how much they're changing organisations like us and how much they're changing our clients. We've just been recently awarded a contract with Lloyds Banking Group, which was the largest private sector outsourcing contract awarded in the UK. And it's been quite interesting. We start in August. We'll be looking after 3,000 buildings. We'll employ 7,000 people just for Lloyds. And the services that we will do will range from everything they need to look after their buildings in the UK. And the annual cost of that to Lloyds will be around 150, 160 million pounds. But what's interesting is the actual cost of energy to them over 1 year is around 80 million pounds. The savings you can generate in outsourcing today, having been in a I guess a sector that has grown very quickly in 25 years, more and more of our clients can save very little through some of their core offerings. Where they can really save money or think very differently is around what they do with the cost of energy. My big question around the cost of energy to any organisation is, do people actually really understand what it is they're spending their money on, and are they actually planning for the long term around what they're doing with their energy costs? I would say we still see very fragmented markets. We see many people doing things in a different way, and we passionately believe that clients need to think much more around long-term energy planning and management. The services we offer, for me, appear quite simple, but for many of our clients seem quite complicated. You know, we look very much around decentralised renewable energy projects, energy consumption reduction, carbon compliance, data management, energy strategy and consultancy. And we've been particularly delighted to acquire Utilix in January this year, which I think gives us additional capability around the consulting side, which I think is really critical to many of our clients, and in particular helping clients with energy procurement, bill validation, commodities, price hedging, etc. But I think the most important thing for me is when you put all of that together, what does that actually tell you? What that tells you is we're still working in incredibly fragmented markets with people learning around new technologies and new ways of working. We were talking yesterday about the fact that just actually having the right data and actually getting clients to understand the data they have and changing the behaviours of their staff on sites can save them 4% of their annual energy spend. That is not very hard to do. It is amazing how few people do that still today. I think it's a really exciting time, though, for all of us. I think we are seeing, for our clients, energy is one of the 3 top controllable costs in their organisation, and they need to do something with that. Do companies really put that at the heart of their business strategy? And I noticed that one of the sessions today is very much around that. I'm not necessarily convinced they do. Should they? Absolutely. And I think it's very much going to be something that changes business strategy for many organisations across the world. Certainly, many of the ones we meet, it is part of what they think about, but it is not everything. So I think we've put, for us, energy sits very much in terms of our planning and our thinking at the heart of what Mighty's about. I think it's an exciting place for the outsourcing industry, for many of you in this room as well. And I think very much that if you take a look forward over the impact this sector will have in the next decade on the cost, not just of energy, but also on carbon reduction, I think they'll be really huge. Thank you very much.
Ruby, thank you very much. Well, we now turn to our first panel of the day, led by Chris Bowden.
Thank you. Hi. Let's get our panel set there. Okay, right. Well, I'll leave Andrew to speak last then. Welcome to the first panel, Future Price of Energy. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Chris Bowden. I'm the CEO and founder of Utilix. For those of you who don't know Utilix, we have a standout there. I won't give you the marketing spiel just now. I know you won't want to listen to that. Thank you, Ruby, for an excellent opening speech. To my right here, I've got Mark Lewis. He's a commodity analyst at Deutsche Bank. Again, I won't tell you too much more about him because his CV's in here. And Mark Nebber, who's from the Climate Group. Okay? If I just kind of set the scene for the panel today, Mark and I were talking earlier about the current economic climate, and I think we're pretty depressed about the situation. I think we may already have seen a Greek exit, or what they're calling a Grexit, if it wasn't for the fact that nobody's really clear about how that's going to work. And also we have an election year in the US, and I think if I was Obama, I'd make sure that wouldn't happen before I was trying to get re-elected. We have developing economies that are stalling in terms of growth. We have wage inflation, which is in some instances at 30% in China and I think 100% in Bangladesh for the cotton workers. You've got bank liquidity and capital availability at all-time lows. Or near all-time lows, and of course we've got Basel III, which, if you don't know anything about Basel III, is a very interesting, not piece of legislation that's coming in 2013, which will create a much tighter capital environment. That's the bad news. The good news is oil prices, as a function of that, are depressed, probably somewhere, I'm guessing, at 10 or 15 dollars above where the Saudis need it. But I think the Saudis are quite happy to push the oil price down for various reasons, but I'll let Mark talk about those. We have weak gas prices as a function of lower oil prices and also the gas shale revolution in the US. Again, I'll leave that to the expert Mark, although I understand that adds 1% to the US's GDP, so quite a kind of amazing stat there. Closer to home, I'm told before 2020 we need to spend £75 billion on new generation because even if we wanted to, we probably wouldn't be able to extend the life of... Andrew, sorry, let me introduce Andrew.
Extend my life, yeah.
Yes, Andrew of iGas. Again, I won't introduce him more than that because you've got his CV in here. I'll let you go first, Andrew. It seems you're obviously completely ready. No, close to home, £75 billion needs to be spent. If you think, if you go back to the 1990s, if you can go back that far, we spent £11 billion on the dash for gas. So just put that into context. You have a policy environment. I think I was much more clear about what was going to happen pre-consultation under EMR than I am today. By the way, could everybody switch off their phone? And I think the debate is becoming increasingly politicised. I think you've probably all seen press, George Osborne talking about the rock banding for onshore wind. So, as a very famous mathematician, John Paulus, said, uncertainty, or paraphrase, uncertainty is the only certainty there is. In discussing this morning's session previously with Jim, we thought we'd set a couple of exam questions before the guys do a presentation. What's the outlook for energy costs in the short, medium, long term? Note I said costs, not just the price of the commodity, but also the taxes and all the other infrastructure costs. And what are corporates going to do about it? So, on that note, I'll open up to Mark.
Yes, thank you, Chris. And, well, I suppose if you're looking at this as a session on the future price of energy, we haven't got much time. I wanted really to focus on big picture drivers and think about the medium to long term rather than the short term. As Chris said in his introduction, there are lots of reasons why you might feel a bit more comfortable with energy prices over the next 6 to 12 months. We're in a very difficult economic environment, and for various reasons, oil prices and other energy prices could fall further over the next 6 to 12 months. But if you step back and think, looking at this as a strategic priority, what is going to happen to energy prices over the long term, medium to long term? My basic paradigm is the following, and it comprises really 5 points. Number one, the oil is the energy commodity that drives every other energy price on the planet, ultimately, directly or indirectly. Secondly, that the price of oil over the long term will rise in real terms and will continue to rise in real terms over the long term. And I'll explain why I think that in a moment. Thirdly, that the cost of renewable technologies will fall over the long term because of 2 main drivers. One is the improvements in technology that are continuing to occur, and secondly, the ability to deploy on a mass scale, so you get the effect of economies of scale. And it follows from those preceding 2 points that the 4th point in my paradigm is that you end up at some point in the future with an inflection point where the cost of renewable energies is cheaper than the cost of oil and other fossil fuel energy sources. And that inflection point is going to happen as a function of how quickly the technology improves and how large a scale the scale on which you deploy that renewable energy, and the rate at which the price of fossil fuels, the cost of fossil fuels rises. But that's the argument. And finally, if you buy that essential argument, that premise, then anything that can be done to accelerate the deployment of renewable energies over the long term is intrinsically a good thing. I mean, it has to be done correctly. It has to be done with the right degree of economic focus on cost-benefit analysis, and obviously there are political considerations that have to be taken into account. But and then when you bring in mind that's kind of the intrinsic part of the energy equation. There are then the externalities that have to be focused on. Carbon emissions in particular. So CO2 pricing will become more and more important around the world. I mean, we're in a situation at the moment where this has slipped way down the political agenda over the last 3 to 4 years. But you'd be surprised, and a lot of you probably are following the debate globally, and you'd be surprised how much is actually going on in this field. China is moving towards regional carbon trading. Australia is introducing a carbon price next week. And in Brazil, in Mexico, in many parts of the developing world, in California from next year, you will have carbon pricing. So this is an ongoing long-term thing, and I think that's what we need to be aware of. Just running through in more detail very briefly, why I think oil prices will continue to rise, because I think that's an absolutely essential premise in this whole argument. And it's a way of depoliticizing the arguments around renewable energy, which too often get caught up in controversies over whether or not climate change is happening and how quickly. You can depoliticize that by focusing on this long-term trend in oil prices. The reason I think oil prices are going up is essentially what you have today that is very different from the oil price shocks of the 70s, is that the oil price shock in the 70s was really a supply-side shock driven by geopolitics, both in 73, 74, and in 79, 80 with the Iranian Revolution. What you have today is both a supply-side shock and a demand-side shock. We're reaching a stage now where physical constraints on the production of oil are becoming clearer and clearer, and where the world is actually relying more on substitutes for crude oil, other forms of petroleum liquids, natural gas liquids, biofuels, and so on. So that is a physical reality. Secondly, what we have is a demand shock that was not there in the 70s. We now have, in addition to the traditional oil importing countries, North America and Western Europe, we have a whole new raft of buyers in Asia primarily, but Latin America as well, some of the fast emerging economies around the world. And this is a scale of demand in terms of how quickly it has come about that is just changing the dynamics of the oil market. But one other very important point that doesn't get the degree of publicity it deserves is that a very important source of demand is out of the Middle East. In other words, from some of the biggest oil producers themselves. Many people, I've given this sort of variation on this presentation many times over the last 6 months. Hardly anybody knows that after China, the country that saw the largest increase in its oil consumption over the last 10 years was Saudi Arabia. More than India, more than Brazil. And this is constraining global exports of crude oil, which have been declining since 2005. There are lots of reasons that I'd be happy to go into to explain in more detail why that is happening, but that is a hugely important factor that is helping to drive, and I believe will continue to help drive oil prices up. So I think we're bullish long-term on the price of energy, and that is good for helping to drive the deployment of renewable energy.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I note that the audience agrees with you, because we had done a survey prior to this, and 37% of you thought it would increase, the energy price would increase by 5% in the next 2 years, and 38%, 5 to 10%. So you're in good company. Mark, could I pass the baton to you, please?
Yes, and I'm certainly not an expert in any way that Mark is on energy prices, so I'm going to look at this from another angle, which is the efficiency side of it. And I think you've slightly changed the question that you put to us, which was originally about energy prices, and then you've talked about energy costs. And I think cost is actually a much better way of looking at this. And we've done work around the world looking with companies, but also at the domestic sector, looking at the impacts of energy prices on energy strategies and on business. And I think that what we've found, and I think which is sort of common knowledge, and I'll just sort of bring up a few figures to start the discussion, is that when energy prices go up, you hope that there will be a impact on energy efficiency investments, and that does happen, but only when you've got long-term certainty that prices are likely to go up. And I think the obvious example is in the vehicle industry. There are different stages. There's different stages in. Is this me?
I don't know. Mine's
my
on the
phone.
floor, so hopefully it's not.
And my phone's over there, so it can't be me. So in the vehicle industry, when you had oil price shocks in the early 70s, once Mark referred to, in the first stage, you have people making changes to their behaviour and their use of transport, beginning of car sharing, car pooling lanes in the US, people deciding to walk, and you remember advertising when I at least was a kid, and I think many of you were kids, and some perhaps not even born, but saying, think about taking your bike or sharing your car and so on and so forth. And then you have the surge in Japanese manufacturers building energy-efficient cars. And that takes longer because you've got to change production lines, change designs, and we see that now. And then you have the next stage, and that was unfortunately undermined by the fact that oil prices came down again. You would see changes in urban infrastructure, the design of way people work and live. And it's the fluctuations that stop that investment happening over the long term. And so I think the question about what prices are going to do in the next year, 2 years, 5 years is interesting for businesses who are planning their energy costs, but not as interesting in terms of what happens in terms of the overall energy infrastructure and the way we use energy. Now, energy efficiency is extremely important for obvious reasons, but when you look at it at the macro level, carbon pricing, other taxes and impacts on energy tend to push costs up, prices up, and this is what Mark said and what we've seen in the survey. But that can, to a large extent and in some cases, be more than compensated by efficiency savings. Now, the numbers around this at the macro level are fiercely disputed depending on which side of the fence you sit on. But, for example, in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the northeast of the United States, it's estimated that consumers have gained $2.1 billion over the 3 years of the existence of RGGI, compared to a loss to the sectors involved or covered directly of about $1 billion, so a net gain of over $1 billion. We've seen that in states that in the US that have, there are 24 states that have full-on energy efficiency programs. They've managed to cut 6% off domestic energy expenditures over the years that they've existed. It's about half a decade now. And then we've seen the DEC analysis of energy market reform, and I suspect there will be some debate over that today, with possible gains for domestic energy users, which, in terms of reduced use, which more than compensate increased prices, though the picture is a bit murkier for the corporate energy sector. But what's true across all these cases, and the same analysis has been done for Australia with the carbon price that's going to be introduced later, in all cases, if you recycle the impact or the carbon price revenues or any energy tax revenue or some part of energy tax revenues into energy efficiency, you can at least offset part of the impact of energy price rises, and in many cases lead to an overall net benefit. Now, just one little example. I think many of you will have seen yesterday the report by the Energy Savings Trust on powering our homes, which suggests that one rather startling and stark piece of information was that 16%, up from 8%, which was originally expected, of our household energy use is on standby, things that are on standby. And it's not just your TVs and appliances, but plugs being left in. And, 16%. Well, just cutting that 16% out would more than compensate for the electricity price rises that people in this survey say are going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. Final point, LED lighting. We've done a lot of work around this around the world. 20% of electricity. Switching from normal incandescent light bulbs to LEDs can save you up to 85 to 90%. If the estimated rise of electricity prices is around 5 to 10% over the next decade, that changing your lighting compensates for that straight away. So you need to think of these in the round.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. So, Andrew, can I pass to you?
Certainly.
Perhaps maybe you could just quickly introduce iGas for those that haven't...
Well, firstly, I'd like to apologise for being late. It's a consequence of changing behaviour in that I tried to find a Boris bike at Waterloo Station this morning and had to resort to a cab, which took me longer to get here, and for which I apologise. So there we go. iGas, just very briefly, is the largest operator of onshore oil and gas fields in the UK. We produce both conventional and unconventional hydrocarbons, producing just under 3,000 barrels of oil a day. But we also have significant unconventional interests in both shale gas and coal bed methane, predominantly in the northwest of England in the Bowland Shale. And I think one of the questions that was on the list of sort of things to come through in this discussion is really, what do we think about gas, and what do we think about the rise of unconventional gas in its impact on raw energy prices, and then as a second order effect what that means for carbon and carbon pricing, or the implications on overall carbon emissions. Firstly, you may be surprised to hear that as someone who's producing the stuff, I don't think it's going to have the same sort of material effect, crashing effect that it's had on US energy prices, taking the cost of gas down from sort of $12 to $14 an MCF down to around $2.5 an MCF. I do not see that happening in Europe, and I definitely don't see it happening in the UK. The reason is what I do see, however, is it probably putting a cap or something of a lid on gas prices going forward, with a whole series of benefits across the energy spectrum. The reason why I don't think that will happen in the same way is actually to do with the sort of systemic shock that came as a result of drilling intensity. So in the States, because landowners have a direct motivation to have people drilling on their land, it means that you get a very quick rollout of sites. We live on a crowded island. Permitting and finding feasible sites means that that rollout is going to be much slower. And so I think it'll fit into a gap in the UK's import dependency, rather than actually systemically changing the price of gas in this country. What I do feel, however, from an economic point of view, is that actually is potentially very interesting for the country as a whole. It's been said in the States that gas at this level puts at least 1% on GDP. You're now seeing a rise in manufacturing and bulk chemical processing onshore in the States, rather than pushing it out into other less regulated economies, which ultimately is good for greenhouse gas emissions, because A, you're consuming the energy closer to where it's being produced, and we should never underestimate the cost of transporting hydrocarbons around the world in terms of their carbon footprint. And secondly, it means that you're dealing in much more regulated environments where emissions of all kinds can be much more easily or more appropriately monitored and managed. So I also think, as a transition fuel in the UK, gas is going to remain incredibly important. I think that's been acknowledged by the coalition as it stands at the moment, and I don't see that situation going away. Unfortunately, we're not in a place where carbon capture and storage is anywhere close to being executable at a commercial level. Therefore, you've got a lot of coal plant that's got to be turned off in a fairly short period of time. The nuclear debate and the level of the subsidies around nuclear will continue, will also become part of not just, in my view, a UK political process, but actually a French political process, which therefore has a great ability to frustrate. So then the only thing you can actually buy out of a box and put in place rapidly is gas-fired generation. And so therefore I think being able to access local forms of gas will be an important part of the future for the UK. And I think that will actually be a very important part of keeping the lights on.
Thank you, Andrew. I understand you'd been to a conference on shale gas, and perhaps maybe you could tell the audience a little bit about what you learned out there. Was it in China or something?
No, I was actually in the US last week.
That's
but,
right.
I mean, really, I think Andrew's articulated very well the situation, and I wouldn't disagree with anything that Andrew's just said. I mean, I think there is a massive difference between what happened in the US and what is likely to be reproducible in other parts of the world. In addition to Europe, people look at China as a basin of shale gas reserves, and it will just take much longer for this form of energy to be released on a large scale into other energy markets around the world, for the reasons that Andrew mentioned. Europe is much more densely populated than the United States. You don't have the same commercial incentive to develop shale gas because the reserves under the ground or in the US are owned by the landowner, but in Europe and almost every other jurisdiction in the world, they revert to the state. And there are special legal principles around the leases that give an incentive to produce very quickly. So for all those reasons, I would agree. I think gas is the transition fuel of choice in Europe in particular and in the UK, because it's very difficult to build coal even under the existing European carbon trading scheme. But in the UK, of course, we will have the carbon price support rate kicking in from 2014, and that will price coal further off the bar relative to gas. Gas is quicker to build than any other fuel. And nuclear, as Andrew said, the debate there is an extremely difficult one in liberalised power markets such as the one we have in the UK. You could argue that we're moving away from liberalised power markets and going back to a more regulated system now in the UK and in other parts of Europe. But, you know, to sell a proposition like nuclear in a liberalised power market is very difficult, because the proposition to potential investors is essentially to say, please give me billions of pounds up front to invest in this nuclear power station. In 7 years' time, I'll be able to produce a product, electricity, to sell into the market, but I can't tell you what the price of that electricity is going to be in 7 years, and therefore I can't tell you what return you're going to get on your investment today. That is just not a saleable proposition in a liberalised power market, which is why the British government is having to come up with all kinds of attempts to support nuclear without saying the subsidy word. And you know, you can have the debate about whether the support that is already being provided and future possible measures that will be introduced, whether that constitutes a subsidy or not. But the fact is, it's not a saleable proposition, I don't think, in a liberalised market. So I think over the next 10 to 15 years, the outlook for gas in Western Europe as the default generation fuel to back up an ever-increasing amount of new renewable capacity is absolutely right.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's just an interesting point that you mentioned to me the other day. Is it true that you use 50,000 barrels of water to drill each of these holes?
Yes, I mean, I think there's clearly a big issue around the water that is required to frack the gas and get the gas out of the ground. And you know, the northwest of England does get quite a lot of rain, but in other parts of the country, like Sussex, I read a very interesting article about Sussex. You know, where you've got hosepipe bans, it's very difficult. And in China, you know, a lot of the gas is far away from the population centres and very difficult to get water out. And Saudi Arabia, which has potentially very large amounts of shale gas, is in the middle of the desert, so getting water there is going to be very difficult. So there are environmental challenges around this, quite apart from the commercial challenges that are very different from the United States.
Right. And just picking up, so controversially discussed with the CBI yesterday that perhaps we could put the EMR on hold given the current macroeconomic situation and have another dash for gas coupled with energy efficiency, and we'd be okay for a few years. What do you think about that?
Well, obviously I'd be supportive of that, but I might be slightly biased. I think implicitly we're going to have a dash for gas anyway, because there's a practical gap that's got to be filled. Energy efficiency is clearly a very important part of delivering that. But you, as I said before, the only thing you can actually, whether it's locally sourced gas or imported gas, the only thing you can actually put in place is generating capacity in a very short period of time to utilise existing grid connects, because actually it's not just about building the generating plant, it's actually being able to get the rest of the grid connection capacity into place to be able to get that generated electricity out to customers. Is gas-fired plants, because you know you can build one in 2 or 3 years. You know what the costs of the input and the output side are, at least the links between the two, which makes the difference from where you stand with nuclear. So I think that's going to happen anyway.
Right.
I just think on you know, there are obviously environmental issues about the way in which you exploit shale gas. There are issues around water, but there are also an awful lot of pieces of work going on about alternative ways of getting that out. So using nitrogen in fracking, for instance, rather than using water. And also, because you inject water in the process of fracking, you do get that water back You then have to just clean it as it comes back. So it's not water lost into the formation. It does come back as a consequence of production.
All of it, or
Bulk of it, yeah.
bulk of it? Okay. And Mark, energy efficiency?
I know. I just wanted to come back to these two fellow panelists on this the idea of transition. I mean, I think it is inevitable from every bit of information I've seen that we will be building more gas. And I'm just interested, I hear over and over again gas as a transition, and I wonder that seems to me to be the case if gas displaces coal and allows renewables to grow. But if gas, as seems to be partly the case in the US, that gas is displacing new renewables development, then maybe you have to ask yourself the question, what is it a transition to? Is it gas as a transition to more gas? Or what does the mix look like at the end? As a transition suggests a journey, and it's not always clear where the journey leads to, and I'm just interested to know what you two think about that within the context of constrained carbon.
I think that in the States you are seeing it as a transition through coal. The primary point is a transition through coal. There's a very, very strong coal lobby in the States. It's a very important part of the political mix. But actually, you've seen a massive change in the US's ability to comply with its climate change targets, just as a consequence of the
in the short term.
But it's moving that way. So the more coal, if coal was eradicated by the production of gas, then the consumption of gas, then that would materially change the US's carbon footprint.
I think the other thing to say is, as Andrew said in his comments earlier, the price of gas in the US has fallen to such low levels that in the short, to levels that I simply do not think are sustainable over the medium, never mind the long term, that in the short run, inevitably, this is halting the momentum of the build-out of renewable energy in the United States. But they're already now starting to talk about the possibility of exporting gas from the US. I mean, there are a lot of political obstacles to that. But the other thing to say is that $2.50 per MMBTU, a lot of conventional gas producers in the US are no longer commercially viable. So you're going to have a market response in the form of production cuts. A lot of the gas producers in the US from January this year have been cutting back their production. And I think, as we go into Q4, maybe Q1 of next year, you will see for the first time that the US's natural gas production is starting to fall, because at these kinds of price levels, not only is it making wind power uneconomic, it's making gas uneconomic. That's the problem. For the reason Andrew mentioned earlier, that you had almost a Wild West scramble because of the commercial incentive to get this rolled out very quickly, and because of the fact that the infrastructure was in place in the United States to make that possible. And again, I'd be interested in Andrew's views on this, but my understanding is in the UK, the onshore oil and gas industry is simply not as well developed. The infrastructure is not as well built out as it was in the US, and that's another reason why a very rapid commercial build-out on the scale we saw in the US is simply not going to be logistically possible, even if it were commercially desirable.
Okay, I'm going to lift the conversation a little bit now. I don't want to focus just purely on gas markets. In Utilix, we have a strapline which is you can buy it, you can generate it, or you can not consume it, and those are your three responses. And if I can recommend anybody, the best one of those is not consume. So I'd just like to go over to Ruby, who's talking about her strategy around moving into energy services, particularly around the reduction in energy consumption, and just ask her a little bit about what she thinks.
It's quite interesting listening to the debates. I think one of the challenges we certainly see with all our clients, and that's many of the FTSE, many of the public sector organisations we work with, is a complete lack of understanding of what all of what you have actually said means to their business strategies. If you take a look at where I think, we shouldn't underestimate the impact of what this recession is doing, not just here but around the world, to organisations, and the impact it's having on their cost bases. We need to have solutions for the short term that help them address that cost base. I think actually we talk a lot about carbon reduction. I don't think that's on every board agenda today. I think what's really on board agendas is cost reduction and how you actually stay viable. And if I really want to be particularly honest about this whole subject, no shareholder of mine has ever asked me about carbon reduction. and no shareholders ever do. So if that's the case, if you're a listed organisation or a PE-backed organisation anywhere in the world, your utter focus on shareholder return, it's not going to be top of your agenda. Not to say that's right, but that very much is the focus. But in a world where you're seeing prices are going to increase, we don't have any evidence to say they're not going to increase, people and organisations have to think differently about how they manage the infrastructure within which they operate. So I think you will see more renewable schemes, but I think that is the right thing for businesses to do. I think the complication of whether prices go up or down, I think all boards just need to assume they're going to go up. And so I think what that will mean is that you will see a lot more around renewables around the world. I think the challenge you have is government policy. I think governments don't sound particularly joined up in the way they speak. And even in the UK, if you look at the impact on the PV industry just from one change which didn't then quite happen, that in itself knocks your ability to believe in government policy. So I would suggest government policy not clear enough, not good enough. I don't think the world is clear enough on where we're going on pricing. All of that represents great risk to any organisation, and therefore they have to focus on how they can reduce the way they actually spend money on energy.
Okay, your opportunity now to ask the panel any questions. Do we have any questions in the audience? Must do. This gentleman over here.
Hello, Simon Mills, City of London Corporation. The panel's focused very much on the wholesale cost of energy, but my organisation is particularly concerned with the retail costs. We brought in a firm of energy analysts about 18 months ago who said that our energy costs are likely to increase by up to 40% over the next 5 years, and this is due to the infrastructure costs being passed on to consumers. Would the panel like to comment on how infrastructure costs and the retail price of energy is likely to affect corporate strategy over the coming years?
I mean, Utilics did a paper for the CBI, which is part of a research piece that they put out, which shows a similar analysis. You have to pay for the infrastructure, and you have to, whether it's through recycling money through the bill, which is exactly how all of this gets paid for, to renewable technologies, to the national grid. The grid infrastructure is very, very old. And Ian will know more about this than anybody, but it's a very old kit and it needs to be replaced, so we have to pay for that. And we have to pay for the subsidies that basically take technologies like renewable technologies from the point where they're uncompetitive to competitive. The UK is a bit of a leader in that respect. And another thing I said to the CBI is the EMR makes us a bit of a test tube for some new technologies, but that's what has to happen. And therefore that's all going to have to get passed through to your bill. So I don't know whether 40% is correct, but it's possible. I mean, some of the grid charges this year went up by more than 10% in the year. So it's not unlikely that would happen. Don't know if anybody...
I would just add that, infrastructure wears out over time and has to be replaced naturally. We've been seeing this in London with the water pipes, which, and there's been a massive capital investment programme in the water industry across the UK because that whole infrastructure was very old. What you have in the power sector is that natural effect compounded by the fact that we are trying to transition to a more sustainable and cleaner energy future. So inevitably there is a compounding effect, but and I don't have the statistics to hand, but I'd be very surprised if that 40% number you're talking about, if that is the right number, if all of that is simply the result of a conscious effort to move towards a cleaner, greener energy future. There's a natural underlying need to replace infrastructure, heavy infrastructure of this kind, in any case, in all major capital infrastructure industries.
Mm. Yeah, and I think another point to add is I think a lot of this analysis is based on the availability of capital to actually replace the infrastructure. And at the moment, there is a concern I have that money won't be available. Or if it is available, it'll be very expensive. So I don't know whether that necessarily makes it worse, because if the money's not there, then the costs will go up a lot more.
But it does come back to the point that Mark was making about the importance of energy efficiency. And if you have a price signal to individual retail consumers, they will respond to price. At the end of the day, what drives changing behaviour is price.
Although to add to that, you need price and ever-improving standards, because price can, as you know, can lead to Jevons paradox, where it becomes cheaper and so you just use more of it.
Yeah.
And that's not only in energy, it's across a range of technologies. So you need to have price and standards in place, whether they're buildings, vehicles, appliances, or whatever it may be.
Good. Any more? Can we have some more questions? There must be lots of questions in the room here. No? Oh, Jim.
We've been talking about the challenges for the UK, particularly around an ageing infrastructure that we need to replace. We've talked about the challenges around shale gas for the UK. Is it possible that we may be moving into a world where other countries are seeing declining energy prices, but the UK may see rising energy prices? Are we becoming slightly decoupled from the rest of the world on this issue?
We start with you, Andrew.
Well, I think what leads to decoupling of energy prices between one geography and another is the inability to transport between the two and tariff barriers as a consequence. So obviously gas is a much more difficult commodity to transport around the world than oil is, although there is now swing in the shape of LNG, which enables you to do that if you've got the ability to import and export LNG from the geographies. So I think all the time that a country is more reliant on imports, it is by definition always going to be more at risk of a more exaggerated movement in prices than if it has its own domestic supply. So therefore, and again, I would say this, wouldn't I? The exploitation of what hydrocarbons we do have, both onshore and offshore in the UKCS, and making sure that those can be accessed as efficiently and effectively as possible, puts the UK in a stronger position.
Got any comments, Mark?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would agree with Andrew on that. I think, if you look at... We're moving into a world, actually, where energy is becoming seen as a very vital strategic resource, and therefore it's not just about the economics, it's about the politics. I mentioned earlier that in the United States, if you have a disparity at the moment, the gas market is a very interesting market globally, because you have such disparities between different jurisdictions. In Asia, Japan at the moment, they're paying $17 to $18 per MMBTU of gas. In the United States, they're paying $2.50. So there are plenty of people in the US who are sitting on all this gas who want to export that gas to Asia and make a very nice spread from doing so, but they're already running into a building political discussion about whether it's in the United States' long-term strategic interest. You've seen resource nationalism in many countries across the world. This is not a new phenomenon, but it's becoming very prevalent again, and the cases that are out there are very well known, but you had a very, very interesting example of it most recently in Argentina. So we're living in a world where, and this just plays to the point, that energy is so vital and so important that you have to take a long-term view on it, and you have to plan rationally and strategically towards it, and take into account not just the economics, but the politics.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I think the various mechanisms under EMR, including the carbon floor price, which is probably one of the most controversial, I think, things in EMR will put us at a disadvantage potentially in Europe, because of the fact that they'll stick with the EU trading system, and we will actually have a floor price which will essentially push our energy prices in the UK above the market mechanism.
It's important and interesting to note, though, that the CPRS in the UK is being introduced by the Treasury, not by DEC. So this is actually primarily a revenue-raising exercise, not an environmental policy, though it has a side effect on
yeah, as you say, as the CFC is now more of a tax than an environmental policy.
How much that carbon poor price... I mean, there will be a difference in timing, but you'll see in other countries that have to make a transition to low-carbon power sectors, they will have to use a set of policies and measures that will, to a certain extent, affect the price of fossil fuels relative to other fuels, so that may normalise over time. And I think also if you look at some work that we and others have done in the first phase of the European Emissions Trading Scheme, and we surveyed companies from every sector that was affected, and with the exception of the aluminium industry, none of them put the carbon price as anywhere near the biggest driver of uncertainty or price rises, or in any case, loss of market share in the industries. The carbon price was dwarfed by exchange rate fluctuations, by volatility in energy prices, cost of hedging, and so on and so forth. So I think, while obviously it is important, it can be overdone, the impact of the price of carbon will have.
And Ruby, what do you think? I mean, the other thing we haven't really talked about is the EMR is there to stimulate the growth of significant generation projects like nuclear and others. But what about on-site generation as an alternative to that?
I think that is going to be more and more one of the things I think about when we're talking about, take a look at the costs of ageing infrastructure in the UK and the costs of I certainly think about many of my clients, most of whom are in very ageing infrastructure. They absolutely need to do more and more of that. If you take a look at the public sector in the UK, it's probably one of their only ways of saving money in the long term. But they need investment. One of the challenges I also see is the banking community and the investment it's prepared to make in this area.
Yeah.
Just on that point, because I think behind Jim's question is that are we going to become less and less competitive as a country going forward if you are decoupling from world energy prices? I mean, if your resource endowment is what it is, and you can't change it. So, you have to optimise it. But if you look at countries like Japan and Germany, which are not particularly well endowed with natural resources, they've become the most successful industrial exporters on the planet by becoming more energy efficient. They are probably the two most energy efficient countries in the world, and they are prospering still, particularly Germany at the moment, in a very high energy price environment. And the example I like to give is the incentive that the German car manufacturing industry has had over many, many years to deal with very high retail petrol prices in Germany, where 60 to 70% of the end user price in Europe as a whole, in Germany, is in the form of taxes to the government. And in the United States, that number would be about 15%. Okay, so the German car manufacturing industry has had to become extremely efficient whilst not compromising on performance. And German cars are the best benchmark in the world in that industry. And it's very interesting to me to note that in 2008, when the oil prices hit $147 a barrel, the car industry that went to the wall was not the German car industry, it was the American car industry, because they'd not had any incentive whatsoever to make their cars more efficient, and they'd relied on very cheap energy prices to drive this a big gas-guzzling SUV form of model that completely broke down when oil prices got to those kinds of levels. So that's an example of how a price signal that encourages energy efficiency leads actually to greater competitiveness over time and not weaker competitiveness.
Yeah. I was in Germany recently, though, and I was told that one of the things that's driving a number of manufacturers now into Eastern Europe is the cost of energy, and there's a significant number of companies that are very upset with the fact that they have to pay back 100 billion euros to investors in PV between now and 2020. Obviously, that PV is using technology that's probably 3, 4, 5 times more expensive than current technology. So there is also an argument to say, perhaps, that investment in these technologies too early in the cycle costs a lot of money. So, I mean, that's a counter-argument to some of the points you make around, energy pricing is, these... Yeah.
There's a big political component to that to encourage jobs in East Germany, so that wasn't just an energy efficiency argument.
David.
When we look at the compound annual growth rate for electricity prices, we're looking at costs doubling for some organisations over maybe a 7-year period. To what extent are we starting to see CFOs of large energy consuming organisations say, well, energy costs as a percentage of profit, or even potentially as a percentage of revenue, are either now or will soon be at a point where we simply have to get our hands around this in a much more strategic way?
I think with a lot of our corporates, I mean, it's right at the top of the board agenda, but I'll pass to Ruby.
Yeah, I think I think it absolutely has to be at the top of every board agenda, because I think it's going to be one of the biggest increasing costs that many companies have. And as an outsourcer, we see that it's also the one area, if you're serious about having to reduce costs in your outsourced services, it's the biggest area of opportunity. And I think that I'm surprised that organisations haven't already got there with it, but I think it is sometimes quite difficult, even, for them to actually understand what that cost is. When I think of the things we do, just in terms of providing data to clients, just in terms of what they actually spend and how they spend it, that is still, we still work in a very fragmented way with many of them, where they don't necessarily understand what their entire portfolios cost, and particularly if they're global. So I think it's the data management and then understanding what you have to do with that data that makes a real difference. I mean, we see, if you take a look at some of the biggest corporates around the world, they don't necessarily have that in a joined-up way. So I think it is very important.
Mark, do you get to meet with the CEOs of big corporates?
I meet mainly with energy companies rather than energy-consuming companies, but
Right.
I would imagine, I used to cover outsourcing companies that were doing outsourcing on behalf of utilities. Ruby mentioned Dalkia earlier, which was a subsidiary of a French company, Veolia, who I know very well. And yes, they've been doing this for many years, and I would expect that level of interest to increase much more as we move into a higher energy pricing environment. It would seem an absolutely obvious way of reducing costs.
Yeah. I mean, just to answer your question, David, in the last 2 weeks, I've met with 2 board directors of probably the 2 companies, the top 20 companies in the UK, and it is a board-level issue. One of our clients has £690 million worth of indirect spend, which is quite a lot. Around 60 million of that is energy, and that's the only thing that moves the dial on that indirect spend. The rest of it drips down at about a 1% movement every year because of improved efficiencies in how they procure things. And then this energy thing just moves the dial on that number. And that's really, if you look at the beta to the impact that it has on the underlying profits of the company, it's quite considerable. If you come, the companies in this room that probably have profits of around through 200, 300, 400 million and energy spends of 50 to 100, if that doubles and you're trading at a PE of 12, you're looking at a £1.2 billion movement or underperformance in your share price if you don't do something about that. And that's how we discuss it with our clients. It's not about, it goes from 100 to 200. It basically knocks 1.2 billion off your share price. And if you look at it like that, then it starts pretty scary and usually when you're talking to the board, they have shares, so then you get their attention. If it's hurting them in the pocket, then it really is an important thing for them. Any other questions? Oh, got one here. Got 2. Oh, great. I'm going to, this gentleman here put his hand up first, and then we'll finish with Rod.
Not necessarily about priority, but thank you. My name is Tristan Mackey from a company called Green Peninsula. We help big corporates deal with the challenges of getting clean energy solutions. I think, I've got the wrong glasses on. I think what would be interesting to know is how the panel at the UK level can get the UK government to actually listen to us. It's the policies and the changing policies have affected, as Ruby said, about PV, but we just need certainty. How do the panel think that we can get the government to listen to big corporates about getting energy to clean energy to sit still and to be able to be invested in?
I'll give that to you, Mark.
Are corporates really asking the question? Are they really demanding that? I mean, we've on a range of climate and clean energy issues over the years, both at the Climate Group and other organisations I've worked on, we've tried to work with businesses to engage with policymakers. And what we found is that when it comes to writing a letter or putting a letter in the FT, they're quite happy to do that. when it comes to board members or chairmen using their one opportunity when they meet the Chancellor each year to bring this issue up, they don't. Because there are lots of other things that they think are greater priorities across a whole range of issues. And so, I think the governments, on the whole, listen at times. They certainly listen to the people and the organisations that generate jobs and growth going forward and investment. But therefore, the onus is to a certain extent on the companies themselves to say that this is a priority. And I would say over the last 10 years, it hasn't been the case. It's been a window dressing priority, but not a, this is my one opportunity to talk to the Chancellor.
Yeah. Can I just give a slight controversial point on that, which is that I think you're absolutely right, more corporates need to talk to them, but they're not particularly joined up and they never come back to you. So I think that the challenge I would give them, and I do whenever I speak to them, is they do need to listen. I think I certainly talk to many of them about this particular issue. I think they've come up with some really good ideas, but they've not implemented and followed through. And I think that's their challenge. And I think they haven't necessarily had all the right advice around them. But I think the corporate world needs to demand more. That's where I do agree. I mean, we certainly do. More need to give that message, and that needs to be done through everybody. Part of the challenge you have is the moment you talk about renewables, that costs money up front. So that's their big issue. And it's how do you avoid that part of the subject, because they will always say they don't have any money.
And just one final closing point. I sit on the CBI Energy Policy Committee. I'm one of 5 end-user consumers that sit on there, or representing end-user consumers, surrounded by about 40 energy generators, producers and suppliers. So if you want to, get on that, anybody here wants to be on the Energy Policy Committee, let me know, because it's totally underweighted towards end users and completely occupied by generators and producers. So if you want to lobby the CBI, please let me know and I'll try and get you on the committee. Thank you, Ruby, Mark, Andrew and Mark. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to our Chris and our first panel today. I think what we've sort of heard so far is that energy is one of the top 3 costs that management can control. We've heard the UK has a particular challenge in its energy setup. We've heard that CFOs should be getting involved if they're not already. But we've also heard that investing in renewables is the long-term goal, and as Mark Lewis said, a good thing. Which takes us quite nicely into our next piece, which is from IKEA. And I don't know if many of you are following IKEA's strategy. It's pretty remarkable. They're investing $670 million in renewable energy. By 2015, they want to have 70% of all of their energy coming from renewable sources. It's a big strategic priority for IKEA. So we're now going to test our technology for the first time today. They're looking quite calm at the back over there. We're now going to try to go live to Sweden to Steve Howard, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at IKEA. Steve, I think I can see you. Can you hear us, see us?
I can hear you. I wouldn't say you were loud and clear, but you're audible.
Great. Well, listen, it's really you talking to us at this stage, so you don't need to hear us. So shall I just hand over to you for 15 minutes?
Yeah. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Very good. Okay, I'll start. I'm sorry I can't join you in person today. Just we had immovable management team meetings here in Sweden, and I'll just briefly just in a minute, shape overall what we're doing on sustainability, but just more from an organisational philosophy point of view, and then how that flows into what we're doing on renewable energy. So, IKEA is the largest home furnishing company in the world, but it's shaped by a vision, which is to help create a better everyday life for the many people. There's a business idea, which is to show that you can deliver good quality products at a low price and to make those available for as many people as possible. And we're a values driven, like many businesses, especially businesses that have been around a long time. We're a values driven business. And we look start things from a values point of view first. The company started where I am now, actually, in southern Sweden in Småland. And Småland's a place sort of rocks and stones where it was hard to scratch out a living. Most people, if you go back 2-3 generations, have a Småland story of how life was hard. And it was, 100 years ago, life was pretty tough. 60, 70 years ago, even life was tough. And it still is in many places. Sorry, excuse me. I thought I silenced that. So the philosophy, and this actually would have sounded very conservative 3-4 years ago, is very much shaped from that sort of those humble origins. It's rather than, let's say, casino finance, it's farm finance, which means you spend money after you've earned it, which doesn't sound revolutionary really, but there's a philosophy there, and we tend to own our assets. So we own our buildings, we own the factories, we own our stores. Where we're vertically integrated into the value chain, we own factories, and that's rather than actually have somebody else own the store and lease it back to you. And that again has shaped our view over electricity. So where we are now, the long-term target's 100% renewables. The 70% for 2015 I was just asked in the press, what's your target? And I said, I anticipate we'll get to 70% by 2015. Although we will firm up a target very soon on a target and timetable. And the reasons for this are values-driven to start. So, we're a big business, we have a lot of impacts, and we want to turn those into positive impacts. We know we're going to be producing products in the future, we know we're going to have stores in the future, and we know we're going to be using electricity in 20 years' time, to state the obvious. Sometimes worth stating the obvious, though. And then saying that we're going to be using electricity in 20 years' time, and you can see from the report you've got for the event today, most people think energy prices are going to increase, and we certainly think that as well. And we think carbon pricing is likely to get stronger rather than weaker. So if the values-driven decision is we want to minimise our negative impacts and promote positive impacts, we want to reduce carbon impacts and promote renewable energy, and the business case is very much to support that is, well, we're going to be using electricity and electricity prices are increasing. It's very easy to construct a full business case that will really say, well, we're going to go renewable, we're going to own our own assets. If we just choose to buy renewable off the grid, then we're going to have still the escalating energy prices. So this is a robust strategy, and we're not big on. We will use financial instruments, but we're not big on using financial instruments, especially over a longer time frame. So it's much better. Let's invest directly in the assets. So today we've made good progress on it, and the figure you quoted that's what we've allocated already for 2015. That's not the money we're going to spend. We'll spend more money than that up to 2015. That's where it's currently allocated against projects. So, for instance, that we've got some wind farms in Poland where the construction will be completed over the next 18 months, and obviously you draw down that investment through that period. It's not all drawn down until completion. We've just announced a new wind farm today, which is a 90 megawatts purchase here in Sweden, actually, in the sort of middle to north of the country. That'll be 30 wind turbines, 3 megawatt turbines. I think it's one of Europe's largest onshore wind farms. We're quite excited about that. So that takes our wind portfolio to 270 megawatts when they're all spinning. Obviously, it takes a couple of years for them all to be fully built. That's a new site in Sweden. It's been through planning, but the construction hasn't started yet. And then on solar, we've done about 75 stores and facilities, including distribution centres so far. We've done more than 250,000 solar panels. The good news is they keep getting cheaper as well. So we use scale to get the price as low as possible with the solar panels, and then we deploy it as widely as we can. So we'll probably get to about 100 facilities by autumn time, by October this year, and then we'll go for a next round as we take lower prices and look where we can get a reasonable payback. We're not after big paybacks, but we want these to be commercially viable. So that takes us, if we put the PV and the wind together, on the wind, we're in 6 countries with the wind farms. We're trying to actually invest in the wind farms in the countries where we've got the biggest footprints, both manufacturing and retail footprints. So we can, wherever possible, supply our own electricity. And we can do that here in Sweden. We can also export it to a couple of our other countries nearby and provide our operations there with renewable energy. So we'll be energy positive in Sweden from as soon as those wind farms are spinning. We'll have a surplus of renewable energy in Sweden, and we'll export that to ourselves in other countries. So we're over 300 megawatts, our portfolio, which is small if you're an electricity company, but if you're a home furnishing company, it's quite a lot of power generation, and that's about 40% or so of our electricity use. We also have some geothermal as well, and we have some biomass, fairly significant biomass projects, which are within our furniture factories where we have, or our board and panel factories, where we have surplus biomass. And the waste biomass there we use for both thermal and electricity generation, thermal power and electricity generation. So good progress, but we will keep going. So the plan is certainly to get to 100% there. And it was interesting to see in the survey you sent out that supply chain was the sort of the biggest gap for everybody. And I would say the same for us. So we've started with suppliers. We focused first on energy efficiency, and we know that the suppliers that are not owned by us, our long-term partners, the 1,100 or so suppliers out there, they're about 3 times as much energy use as we are, with our direct operations and stores and factories. So there's a bigger opportunity there and a bigger risk. So we're rolling out a similar strategy for ourselves into the supply chain. First focus is the low-hanging fruit, because the energy efficiency opportunity is bigger in the supply chain. There's more inefficiencies there, even though we still have them today in our own operations that we're harvesting. But we'll pursue supply chain renewables as well, and we'll set a target in the next 6 to 12 months for renewables in our supply chain. It won't be 100% in the same time frame for our own business, because we're in more than 50 countries. It's more complicated. We'll focus on the areas where we've got the big clusters of suppliers, especially where there's a strong, if it's in Eastern Europe or elsewhere where you've got a lot of coal-based power, and we can really have the best impact there. So that's in a nutshell where we are. My simple thesis, it's interesting, IKEA is foundation owned, so we're not listed. But I don't think that fundamentally changes the strategy. It does mean we take a long-term view. And it's the same long-term view. If we enter a country, then we'll know it may take several years before you have the full setup there, before you can achieve profitability there. So we'll make that long-term investment decision. It's not a 3-year payback. It could be much longer than that as you move into a new market. And it's the same approach we'll take to other issues. But if we were listed, I think now the mood has changed, and really any company that's got cash, any company that has that's doing reasonably well financially, can make long-term investment decisions. I would suggest, and really insulating yourselves from future energy price rises and from carbon price increases, and as well as doing the right thing, fundamentally just doing the right thing from a business leadership point of view, I think is something there's real legitimacy for. So I would suggest that let's all do this, and let's have a broad array of companies that are up there saying we're going to generate 100% of our power, our own power, from renewable energy assets we own ourselves. and will drive energy efficiency across our business and through the supply chain as well. And, if we can do that, I think it will serve us well from a business point of view in the long term. These are all commercially rational things to do. They're not commercially irrational. Once the money's invested, you start to get decent revenues. And actually, it's interesting, from a balanced point of view, it's not contingent then on how much home furnishing stuff you sell. It's actually, sofa sales do not impact revenue from wind farms. So it diversifies your business in uncertain and volatile times as well. So we'll keep going. And, I'd hope that if we can find the right wind farms and more solar investments, then we'll make some more investment decisions in the next 6 to 12 months as well to keep going. But I'm pleased for where we are now at 40% when everything's spinning. We're on track for where I'd like us to be. Thank you. I don't think we've got any chance for any questions, have we? But hopefully be with you physically next time, and I hope you have a really good event.
Steve, that's great. Thank you very much. I have to say, IKEA make it look easy. A really inspiring strategy. Steve referred there to the survey where I think 4% of respondents said they felt they'd made much progress in energy in their supply chain. So, it's a real litmus test of leadership, and just hearing Steve talk about that reinforced how well IKEA are doing. So just a few things before we break. Firstly, there will be no access to this room during the break because we're going to need to put the partition up. And it's a great chance to just go and explore all the exhibitors we have outside. If you have pre-scheduled meetings, these take place at the booths in the networking area. During the break, please try and work out where your round table is. You don't need to sit at your round table, but just know where it is because we're going to move into those after the first session, after the break. And everyone's got their round table number on their badge if they are attending a round table. Just remember, you need to make a choice here. You need to work out, do you want to be transformation or strategy? Early birds catch worms. And one final thing, the Wi-Fi code, for those who want to link up to the Wi-Fi, is down incorrectly in your program. It should be ETC V4062. So there's a V missing after the ETC. So see you all back at 5 to 11.